Matthew right now especially is building a lot of things one on top of another. And over the last weeks, we've followed Jesus as things have come to this high stakes time in his life. Jerusalem came with their first engagement with Jesus. Matthew's foreshadowing where things are going, and Jesus in Jerusalem, the capital of religious power, they're on a collision course. It's a showdown between the old and the new. It's a showdown between the old religion of gods that need satisfied by blood, and Jesus coming and saying, I'm here to show you who God really is in person. And Matthew's been telling us time and again in many different ways, the old and the new, they cannot coexist. Well, as the Pharisees from Jerusalem came to Jesus, he first undermined their traditions that they had built upon the law from the Old Testament that we looked at, from the First Testament. And Moses and their law said that you can't, what you eat, it can defile you. Jesus says that's not how defilement works. He says what you eat simply goes in and comes out. That's essentially how he describes it in the scripture. It's in one end, out the other end, and that's it. He says what defiles you. And defilement is it destroys community. Defilement is broken community too. And what destroys community are bad actions and words that come out of our heart. Jesus says that's what defiles you. And on the heels of that conflict, Jesus heads off to the Gentiles. He's a new Joshua entering the land of Canaan, and he meets a Canaanite woman there. And Matthew uses this phrase, Jesus left that place. Jesus leaves the Canaanite place, and the Gentiles follow him into the wilderness to a mountain. Jesus is leading a new exodus. And it's with the Gentiles. In the First Testament, it was the Jews, and now it's the Gentiles. And the Jews have had their exodus long ago out of Egypt into the wilderness to meet God on a mountain in his glory. And as God before our eyes, Jesus reenacted the Jewish exodus in Matthew 5 and Matthew 14. But now the Gentiles are getting their own exodus. They're getting to come out of darkness, being led by divine light. Jesus is seen as meeting the Gentiles in their land of captivity. And we can say, well, captivity to what? The Canaanite woman tells us, she says, my daughter is being afflicted by evil forces. Evil is coming against my daughter. Please save her. So the exodus of the Gentiles takes place out of captivity to the forces of evil. They follow God in the person of Jesus, and they come to their own Mount Sinai, their moment where God in his glory meets them. And we ended last week with two lessons from Mount Sinai that's found in the context of Exodus 24 and 25, and we see it with Jesus and the Gentiles. First, we read that Jesus is the glory of God in its fullness. To see Jesus is to see the Father. To see Jesus is to see God. To experience Jesus is to experience the perfect love of the divine. So Jesus is the glory of God in its fullness, and just as God's glory rested on the mountain back in the book of Exodus, now Jesus, God's glory, rests on the Gentile Mount Sinai. And just as God's glory is described in the first Exodus, a couple thousand years before this, to be like a devouring fire, Jesus, as the full glory of God, shows us just what that fire is. It's a fire of mercy. Jesus, God's glory, he burns with mercy to the point it consumes the lynching of God. Humanity kills love itself, but the fire of mercy devours its own murder in flames that dance with forgiveness. On the cross, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. If we'll grab onto this and if we will realize that the worst that could be done was done, the killing of the creator by the created. But forgiveness was expressed in that. If we can grab onto the realization of just how great the fire of mercy is, we can throw anything into the sacred fire and realize forgiveness is returned. To realize this and rest in this is to change your life. The second lesson from the two Mount Sinai's is that God does not want to simply be left on the mountain. Mountaintops are great times. Mountaintops are those pinnacle experiences outside of the downside of life, the valleys that we enter into in life, the pits. Mountaintop times are great times. And we mark even each Sunday as a mountaintop time where we come together as a community and we have a great time together before we descend back into the valleys of whatever we're dealing with in life. But God doesn't want to just be found on the mountain. He wants to live with us in our lives. And he says it in the plural. He wants to live within community. He wants to live within the lives of people in groups. And from Exodus 25 and from the life of Jesus, we found out how a home is made for him in communities, in groups of people, so that he can live with them off the mountaintop. It's through charity. God says, my sanctuary is built from charity. Where there's charity, you're building my home to live with people off the mountain. As we end this section of Jesus' journey with the Gentiles, it's great to consider that we saw some cool things with Jesus and Gentiles, Jesus and the Canaanite woman, Jesus feeding the 4,000, Jesus healing people. But it's important to also see that equally important, perhaps more important, is what the disciples are learning. Because I believe that more dangerous for God, more dangerous for Christianity, more dangerous than the pagan who doesn't claim to represent God in any way, is the one who claims to represent God and does so destructively and does so with grievous error that hurts and destroys people. And the disciples have shown up to this point, they don't know how to represent God well. They don't know how to represent the divine well, but they're learning. And so this journey through Gentile land is their learning experience. With his Gentile trip complete, let's see if I can get the first, let me do the slide. Can we go to the first slide there with the passage on it? Solomon there. There we go. Should be, nope, this is it. So his Gentile trip complete, Jesus, it says, after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. This is back to the Jewish land. And so if we go to the next slide, the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. So Jesus returns to the Jewish land, and he's met by the Pharisees and now the Sadducees. These are two sides of the extremes of God's people. The Pharisees were generally what we might call today lay leaders, rather than official clergy. The term comes from Greek, which simply means the people. It means the common people. And the church adopted this term to describe leaders and pastors who stepped up and showed themselves to be leaders out of the crowd. They had no formal training or certificate. They simply were recognized by others as this is a leader. They didn't rise through the ranks of the privileged schools of the clergy. And so lay pastors, they distinguish themselves. And sadly, though, through church history, there's been a lot of disdain for lay leaders. They've been looked down upon as less educated, less enabled to do the work. And so these are the Pharisees, Israel's lay leaders. They might best be described as one side of God's people they're more scripture-centered or law-centered. And they dealt with scripture and the common people more often than the Sadducees in daily living. They also had a concern to be separate from the world. Now the Sadducees, they were the official clergy. They were the ones they'd received the seminary graduate certificate. They were recognized as one of the in people they could wear the badge of honor, that they were the official clergy, and they lived in the upper echelons of society. They were high class and high income. And I hate to say it, I don't mean offense to every megachurch pastor, but think of your megachurch pastor's stereotype. Making a lot of money, living as higher income individuals. And the Sadducees, they were more broadly associated with formal religion and with Israel's priesthood. They were the card-carrying formal leaders of Israel. While the Pharisees might be more described as scripture-centered, the Sadducees would be described as religious-centered. They made up most of the priesthood, and they concerned themselves with the working of the temple and all the religious practices that had to go into the temple. They dealt with the church as the Jews knew it, and the practice of how religion was to be done in the church. Also, in order to maintain position and power and status. We might call them in a contemporary setting for church leaders, they sought to be relevant. They sought to be relevant to the environment that they were in, relevant to the other powers in the world around them. And so the Pharisees sought to separate themselves from the world. The Sadducees were like, well, if we get in with the world, we can stay on top with them, and we can kind of keep the temple here and in good standing. And so they sought to be relevant. And typically the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they actually butted heads against each other. And they even held some contradictory beliefs. But here they come to find unity against Jesus. The drama first ratcheted up when Jerusalem came on the scene in the last chapter. But the appearance of the Sadducees, for the original readers, this would have been the cliffhanger of cliffhangers. Now the Sadducees are here. This is the first time the Sadducees and Jesus have crossed paths. Up until the last chapter, it was the country amateurs against Jesus. It was the Pharisees, it was the lay leaders, the ones who hadn't graduated from seminary, and the ones who also lived out in the country. They weren't even in the city. They weren't sophisticated city folks. These Pharisees were the country Pharisees. So it had been Jesus against the country amateurs. The informal leadership of the Pharisees, they were dealing with Jesus up until now. Then in Matthew 15, Jerusalem sends its own Pharisees. And it's like at this time, Jesus is in this middle ground. Jerusalem realizes this is someone who might need to be addressed. But is he really big enough to concern the upper class people with? Is he really big enough for us to leave our comfortable homes and to deal with him? Yeah, let's send the second tier leaders. These Pharisees here in Jerusalem, they're better than the country Pharisees because they come from sophistication. Let's send the second tier first. It's like a bad movie where the most novice henchmen go after the guy, and then the next level, and then finally you're getting to the harder levels. And so Jerusalem sends the second tier leadership to see, let's go see what's really going on, because maybe these country Pharisees, they don't even know what they're dealing with. They don't know how to fix this. So the Pharisees from Jerusalem come to see Jesus, and Jesus gets their attention. The Pharisees from Jerusalem, they run back to Jerusalem to report, Jesus not only stepped on our tradition, he contradicted Moses. He contradicted the temple religious stuff. Because he said, food doesn't even defile. That's not how it works. Now the Sadducees, they care about this now. Feathers are ruffled. And so it seems that Jesus has been determined now to be a threat. So now the Pharisees and Sadducees have teamed up together. The threat of Jesus has moved the Pharisees to team up with the Sadducees. And the Sadducees have left their comforts of Jerusalem to go into the dusty countryside and deal with this problem. The last time the Sadducees and the Pharisees had teamed up was when they came out to see John the Baptist. On the heels of three great moments of hungry people seeking Jesus, a Canaanite woman, scores of people coming to the Gentile Mount Sinai to be healed, and then 4,000 men with also women and children being fed by Jesus. After these three great moments, we have the antithesis here. Matthew sets this up as the opposite, polar opposites. And he sets it up amazingly, and I love his play on words. And as we go through Jesus' engagement with the Pharisees and Sadducees, we're going to see how there are polar opposite responses to divine love coming into a world that fights for position, power, money, and prestige. For now, I want to look at this idea that Matthew uses in this section, and he shows with the same Greek word different ways that we come to Jesus, different ways that we come to the embodiment of divine glory. Let's go to the next slide, Solomon, Matthew 15:22. Here's the first way that we come to Jesus. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region, this is the Canaanite region, the region associated with darkness. A Canaanite woman from that region came out to Jesus. The Canaanite woman comes out to find Jesus. Just like Peter leaves the boat, very often we come to Jesus out of somewhere. We come to encounter divine love and divine light out of a place of darkness. A place where we weren't in direct contact with God. In this case, the woman is seen to be moving out of the land associated with the darkness towards the light of Jesus. So the first way from this section, the first way that we see we can come to Jesus is to come out of somewhere. Come out of somewhere to somewhere new. That's what this woman's doing. If we go to the next slide, here's another way to come to Jesus. Jesus didn't answer at all, and we saw that this is because he's leaving room for his disciples. Jesus is trying to hand things off to his disciples, equip them, and he leaves space for the disciples to speak. So here's another way to come to Jesus. The disciples came to Jesus and urged him, "Send her away. She annoys us." So Jesus' disciples, they come to Jesus, wanting Jesus to solve their annoyances. In some way, they come to Jesus in ignorance because they have yet to grasp what's really going on and who God is. But in their ignorance, they also come with a demand. It's a demand that has no respect within it, and it's a statement of simply what they want. Divine love. Send her away unlovingly. Get this annoyance out of my life. That's a way we can come to Jesus. We go to the next slide. But she, this is the Canaanite woman, she came, again, she comes to Jesus. She came and knelt before Jesus saying, "Lord, help me." Now the Canaanite woman, she comes to Jesus again, and this time she's already with Jesus. She's not coming out of anywhere. But she comes to Jesus in contrast to what the disciples just did and how they came to Jesus. The disciples, they make an us-them statement. Save us from her. She annoys us. We don't want to deal with her. Save us from her. The woman comes to Jesus simply with a plea for her own sake. Jesus, help me. I have to stop here. I have to stop here and nerd out for a moment and go on another detail. Notice that the woman's problem, as we read the story, is her daughter. Her daughter actually has the problem. Her daughter is being oppressed by evil forces. The problem is her daughter's. But her daughter's problem is her problem. As long as her offspring, as long as her daughter is oppressed, The mother's not free. The mother and daughter are presented here as one. In this little comment, Lord, help me, as the mother owns her daughter's suffering. In this little comment of hers that makes her and her daughter one, here's a Gentile woman, a Canaanite woman, preaching the gospel. She is preaching the good news that the God, our Creator, has a heart like this woman. And the problems of the humanity that he birthed, the problems of the Creator's offspring that he gave life to, those problems are his as well. This woman is expressing the heart of God, and this woman has come out of the region of darkness to seek the light, to seek a solution for her daughter's problem that is also her problem. And all the way back to the start of Matthew's gospel, Matthew tells us that God has come through Jesus from the realm of light into a dark world. I don't know any other divine I want than a divine who gets his hands dirty and comes into darkness. I love, this is the God I love. Matthew tells us that God has come through Jesus from light to dark. This is a mother coming from dark to light. This mother is a mirror of God. By gender, she is the reflection side of the Father. By action, she is a mirror of God's action. Through God, from the parent comes the son. From the daughter comes the mother towards the son. By offspring, her daughter is not only the gender mirror to the son, Jesus, but their circumstances are mirrors. One needs rescued from evil forces. The other will give themselves up to evil to defeat it. This woman is a living mirror to the inseparability of parent from child. She speaks to the inseparability of God the Father from God the Son. One is the other. Even more, she is a Gentile Mary. As far as I can remember off the top of my head, this is the only place in the Gospels where a mother's identity is uniquely connected personally with the suffering of their offspring at the hands of evil forces. So that the mother suffers as the child suffers. So this Gentile woman foreshadows that Mary, Jesus' mother, will suffer as she watches evil forces come against her child. So the Canaanite woman and her Canaanite daughter become human mirrors of God the Father and Jesus the Son. And she also, as a Canaanite, she gets to be the one to exemplify the unique suffering of a mother for a child under suffering themselves. She is the Gentile revelation of what Mary will experience in its fullness at the cross. So a Canaanite gets to teach us, gets to preach to us with her life of the incredible co-suffering unity of God as Father and Son, as well as the intense suffering of mother and offspring at the crucifixion. So to refocus us back, though, to how we approach Jesus. We can come to Jesus out of darkness and into light. We can come to Jesus with demands born out of annoyance. We can come to Jesus and ask him to reject those who we don't think he should help. But deeper than that in the disciples, what we see is we can come to Jesus not understanding everything, not knowing yet how things should work. And so we speak out of a lack of understanding. And like the second time the Canaanite woman approaches Jesus, we can come to Jesus for ourselves rather than against others. So we can continue. The next slide, Solomon, please. Great crowds came to Jesus, bringing with them the lame. And so the Canaanite woman was the first Gentile in this journey to come to Jesus. But now many are coming to Jesus. And they come with their problems for Jesus to fix. But even more, they come to abide with divinity. They come to abide with the enfleshment of God. And we find out that for 3 days, they spend their time with Jesus without food. Across these instances, what we find is those who come out of darkness and into light, they will find freedom. Those who come to Jesus lacking understanding and even saying things that later on are going to be like, but those that come to Jesus and lack understanding, they will find patience and guidance. Those who come to Jesus for their own sake, they'll find a Jesus ready to act for their sake. Those who come with problems, they will find Jesus as the fire of mercy, devouring, burning away the obstacles, the problems. Finally, for those who come simply to abide and persevere with Jesus, even in hard times when there's no ready food available or whatever happens in our lives, they'll find themselves present at times of amazing plentifulness. As Jesus comes back to Jewish lands, we find another manner in which we can come to Jesus. The next slide, Solomon. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus to test him, to ask him for a sign from heaven. Some take this passage to believe that having doubt and asking for a divine sign, that's wrong, that's bad to do. Is it? Find out next week when you tune in. We'll pick this up next week as the drama ramps up and Jesus faces the Sadducees who are now on the scene. The kids are going to come back in here in a second. But before Nate gets up to close us with worship, I want to invite you to slowly walk through a list of the ways you can come to the divine, to divine glory, to divine love. If we go to the last slide, Solomon. Okay, that's big enough to read. I want to go through this slowly and let this sink in, and perhaps have you consider in our closing worship, how would you draw close to God today? How do you need to come to the divine today? Have you been experiencing a dark time and you need to come out into divine light and freedom? Do you need to approach Jesus? Do you need to approach divine love without any concern for your human lack of understanding the full picture, which means that we're going to speak words of annoyance, we're going to speak words of frustration. We lack the big picture, and we're going to speak words that still show we're wrestling with prejudices, we're wrestling with limited understandings. That's fine if that's how you need to come to Jesus, because he's the patient teacher. So if you need to come to Jesus and just say whatever words come to mind, you can come to Jesus that way. Do you need to come to Jesus for your own sake, setting aside the care of anyone else? Like the Canaanite woman. The disciples cared about the woman and asked for God to send her away. They cared about someone else, but the woman cared about what her problem was. So you need to come to Jesus for your own sake, setting aside the cares, the concerns for others, and just be there for you. Do you need to come to him right now and seek a moment of his merciful, devouring fire? A fire that consumes the obstacles from nature and from nurture, that keep us from fully experiencing love and life. Maybe in our closing worship today, you need to come and abide with the divine in the wilderness of life. A place where it seems you haven't been nourished for a while. A place where it feels like you might be wasting away. And you're waiting to see when Jesus is going to give provision. It's in that time that I believe we learn to realize God's enough. Being in touch with the divine is enough. So I invite you to consider from the ways that we can come to Jesus. Come to the revelation of the divine. How would you want to come as we close with worship? Consider that as we close with our last song.